it in front of you if I could.
Hello! Good morning, everybody. Welcome. I'm going to turn everything over to Dan Miller, who will be moderating and chairing this particular program. Thanks, everybody, for coming, and have a good time.
Well, this is being videotaped, so I think we need to stay in our own positions, and then we're going to hold all the questions to the end. But welcome. I've been really intrigued about Tidy Island ever since it got started. Linda and I moved here to Tidy Island in 2010, 9 years. But we lived in Palmasola Park for 36 years. So we lived close, and I was a developer actually in downtown Brighton doing commercial stuff. But I was always intrigued what was happening. The more you walk the island, you wonder, how did this come about? Why is this happening? And that's where the idea of doing a panel that we have here today. The first time, I don't want to tell stories too much, but the first time I visited Tidy Island, we came to a Christmas party at Harold and Barbara Chastain's house, and it had to be like in 84, 85, and Frank and Emily Busker were with us actually. And I remember leaving that night, and we had snow on the causeway. Yeah. Snow was a rare thing to see in Brighton, but it was really fun. You might remember that time of snow. It was a Christmas party, I'm pretty sure. We couldn't see much of Tidy Island. One thing that we find out today and talk about it is Tidy is so unique for us because it can never be built today. Environmentally, there's no way you will find out that you could ever build that causeway and create what they have here. The other thing is the density is so low here. Normally these days you need houses close together and packed in, and high-rise, and you don't have that here. So we're a very unique situation. So decided to try to put something together and talk about it. So the first person I called was Randy Chastain. And Randy lives in Nashville, Tennessee now. I got a cell number from Barbara. And he wasn't coming down this winter, but he may come down next winter, he said. So if he does, we may have another program like this or something with Randy. Because he's so critical to everything here at Tidy Island. But we have three people that were very instrumental in what took place in the 1980s with us today. We have Tom Walter at the end, and most of y'all probably know Tom. He lives here on Tidy Island, his wife Pam. They were residents since 1984, an early resident. How many people were here in the 1980s? I'm just curious. Oh, wow. Wow. I'm at 2010. Wow, well, that's great. So you're going to enjoy this presentation. So Tom was the architect for Tidy Island. We'll talk about the architectural issue. Lynn is a retired engineer with Zoller and Najjar Engineering. And he did the engineering, which is the infrastructure, the permitting and the causeway and the roadway and the dredging and filling and such. And then we have Jim Pullen. Now, Jim Pullen was listed as developer. And I'm not exactly sure what your title should be, but what Jim's background, first question I'm going to ask is going to explain a little bit more about what their role was back in the 1980s. But Jim is a CPA and was a controller for Chastain Development, a company that Randy Chastain owned. And Randy Chastain started Tidy Island in 83, 84. But he got into serious financial problems in about 86. These years, this is 35 years ago we're reminiscing about. And he was developing a lot of projects. He did the project right by the gatehouse as you come into Tidy. He was doing Waterway, I think, or whatever it is, on Cortez Road. He had 3 projects on Anna Maria. And I think he just got overextended, and he just gave up on everything and moved out of town in about 1986. So he was only involved in this for a couple of years. Jim was working for Randy at the time, and then when the bank that took over Tidy Island hired Jim to finish up all the construction projects going from about 86 to 89. And so that's how Jim's connection is. He is now works at Morgan Stanley in Sarasota, and we happened to run into each other yesterday at lunch. I hadn't seen him for years. His wife is a headmaster at St. Stephen's, for anybody that knows anything about St. Stephen's. But anyway, let me start off. What I'm going to do is ask some general questions for everybody, and then we'll get specific. So the first one is, as a means to introduce yourself to everybody here, tell us what you were doing back in the early 80s, how you met Randy Chastain, and what did he ask you to do with Tidy Island. Then I'm going to start with you, since infrastructure was first.
Okay. My name is Lynn Najjar.
back in the early 80s, I had, well, we'd start before that. In 1977, I moved to this area and I joined Dan Zoller, who was a well-established engineer in the area. Dan had been born and raised in Bradenton. And I had gotten to know Dan because I was hired by the county. When I first moved to town, I was hired by the county to do work with the Central Library in downtown Bradenton. And Dan was on a selection committee for the county that wound up hiring me to get involved with that project. So I got to know Dan, and after that project was finished, Dan asked me to come to work with him. And I talked to him, and he said, I'm willing to make you a full partner of the firm. And so Dan and I went into business together. He was always great to work with, and we got along just fine for a long time until Dan finally retired. So I started with Zoller and Najjar, as it was called back then, in '77. And we had done several projects with Randy, like was mentioned, prior to Tidy Island. But basically, my involvement at that point was a principal in charge of this project. This was a very unusual project, as we'll talk about a little bit more later. But so I was a principal in the firm and had background in both civil and structural engineering. And so we had done work with Randy, so this was a natural for us to go on and take on as a project with Randy.
Pam and I moved to Sarasota in 1973 after we graduated from the University of Florida. And
Go Gators.
yeah, I worked for an architectural firm in Sarasota until 1978. Then started my own firm. We basically had a construction company and an architectural firm and did large custom single-family homes. And then somewhere in the early 80s, we were introduced to Randy, and we did houses for him. Bay Lakes Estates up the road here was the first project we did for him. And then we did Summer Sands that's out on the beach, and Bay Hollow, which is just before you come onto the island. And he had asked us if we'd be interested in working on a unique project out here, and we said, of course we would. So we worked with him for a couple of years trying to decide what the product was going to be while the environmental studies were being done on the island. And so we developed the concept after we spent some time going up the east coast of the United States with Randy one time, looking at a lot of stuff that when we got on the plane to fly home, he said, well, I've seen a lot of what I don't want. So from there we developed this, and it's a mixture of old New England and old Florida. So that's where I got involved.
Jim?
I grew up in Bradenton, and I was a CPA, and actually I kind of got connected through Peggy Haggerty's husband. To make a story quickly, like I said, I was a CPA, and I actually met Jim Haggerty at a Christmas party, and I can't remember what year it might have been, 1982, whatever year it might have been. So it was around the buffet table, so to speak, and he asked me who I was and what I did for a living, and I said, well, I was a CPA, but I really didn't want to do that anymore. I want to do something else. And he says, I think I've got an idea for you. And at that time, Mr. Haggerty was the president, probably chairman of what was referred to as First City Federal, which was a large savings and loan here in the 80s. And so I got a call from one of his associates next Monday. Probably a week later, I was working for, at that time, they had subsidiary corporations that were able to do what was referred to as joint venture financing and real estate projects. And it was just something that was created by the Federal Home Loan Bank Board back in the late 70s and 80s to help the savings and loans bail out of the troubles they were in. So I worked there for about a year, and we had a dozen different projects, and not all projects, of course, work out, not all real estate projects. And in that time, Randy Chastain and his business partner, Jim Simons, were two of our borrowers at that time. And so I met them through the course of work, and Randy and his partner, Jim Simons, says, we're really growing leaps and bounds, and we need someone to be a controller for us. Would you like to do that? And I said, sure. So that's how I got involved. So like Dan said, the parent company, so to speak, was Chastain Development Corporation at that time. So I went to work for Chastain Development Corporation at that time. And that's how I initially got involved with Randy Chastain in this project.
By the way, there's pictures here on the wall. I get a chance. Neil McCurry loaned it to us. It's some aerial photographs of Tidy in the 1980s that we have here. And there's some newspaper things that came out in the mid-1980s. Let me ask a question now for each of y'all. What was it like your first time coming to Tidy Island before anything was done here? I mean, there's no bridge to the island, or how did you get to the island? Was there a wooden bridge, or what? Did you have to come? Someone said they came in by some of the big wheels on it. So, who wants to start?
I'll start. First time we came onto the island, we had to come out at low tide in a four-wheel drive vehicle. There was a dirt road that pretty much parallels where the causeway is right now. And very rocky, still water going through the inlet there. And four-wheel drive vehicle made it across, and we got to the other side. And then we were immediately stopped by a massive amount of Brazilian peppers and Australian pines. And the only way to get from that end of the island to this end of the island was to follow behind the small bulldozer. That's how much vegetation was down through the center of the island. You couldn't see anything. You couldn't see when you were standing behind the bulldozer, you couldn't see the water.
Lynn?
I think I probably came out to the island a little later than Tom did, but I do remember similar type situations going across at low tide in a four-wheel vehicle to get out here. Our firm did surveying as well as engineering, so one of the first steps in trying to even do some sort of a plan for the project was to have the surveyors come out. So I think I probably came out with the survey crew on one of their early visits here, and again, I don't think we went all the way, or I didn't anyway, went all the way down to the end of the island, but we got into the island somewhat just to get a feel for what was here and what we were up against. So that's kind of my first experience.
So there was a lot of Brazilian peppers and Australian pine stuff, non-native stuff.
A lot, yes. And the environmentalists spent, what, a year or so trying to tag everything that we could identify to save.
To save, right, exactly.
And the other things that they wanted us to get rid of because they didn't want us to keep the Brazilian peppers.
Yeah. Typically, there was a requirement that you remove Brazilian peppers that you came across. There were just so many on this island, we couldn't remove them all in the same way with the Australian pines. As you can see, there's still a number of them around. But in most projects, the state wanted us to get rid of those invasive species. They're not native, and they consider them a kind of a nuisance species.
Jim, you came to the place that's already underway.
Well, yeah, actually I came out here, first time I had ever heard about it was, I remember exactly where I was at the time, in 1980, before topside development started. Even though I lived here, I had never heard of it. And to girls told me about it, and I said, what is that? And they said, well, it's a place that people go out and they shoot their rifles and they camp and they drive their four-wheel drives and all like this. And I said, oh, okay. So I wandered out here one time by myself, and I couldn't get far, like Tom says. And I don't remember if it was low tide or high tide or whatever it was, but I waded across at least to a little bit, and there was no one out here at that time, of course, no at that time. But that was well before the development goes, but I can distinctly remember that was their comments about it. And I said, well, that's interesting, and that was the extent of it, sort of right. And so, but the first time I actually came out after the development had started, the causeway was built, and I think the first three model buildings were not yet completed. So it would have been 1983, thereabouts, somewhere in that time period. They were close to those three buildings started, and I was in awe of the architecture of the buildings, and they are, as everyone knows, very, very, very beautiful. They really are. They're really unique, and so that was pretty much the extent of it. The road didn't extend obviously all the way through here, so at that time, but it was probably came halfway through, partway through.
Yeah, ask one more general question, we'll get to specific ones. What was the vision that Randy had? I've always heard Randy, I've never met Randy, but that Randy was a visionary. And you mentioned a little bit about touring different places. I'm gonna let you go, Tom, first. What was his vision to develop here?
One of the articles that's up here, everybody might want to take a look at. There's some nice comments in here that Randy had given to the newspaper, and that was published in 1984. Randy bought this property from a gentleman that developed the retirement community Mount Vernon. And the Gil Waters. And Gil passed away just a year or so ago.
Yeah.
Gil was a visionary, but of a different type. Gil had a tendency to want to develop everything to the hill. And I remember Randy telling me one time that when he convinced Gil to sell him this property, Gil's idea was to put 6 high-rises out here. And Randy said that wasn't in his mind frame at all, that he believed that this needed to be a low-density community, something that would be calming and rival living in a single-family home, but somebody could live here and not be worried about whether they're going to be here 6 months out of the year or gone for 6 months out of the year. And it's true, you come across the causeway and everything seems to leave you behind. So that's what he wanted to do these so that they were almost like custom single-family homes. Even though the architecture is similar in nature from building to building and unit to unit. If you have ever been in a bunch of the units, you won't find many of them that are the same inside at all. And as we were doing them, they would sell them basically the footprint, and then much of the time we would come in and custom design the inside of the unit to meet the owner's requests.
It said in one article that Randy paid $1.5 million to Gil for the property back in 1982. And I didn't realize Gil had it from the mid-70s or something.
Yeah, now I don't know when Gil bought it and who he bought it from, but
Dr. Sugg and Dr.
he had it. He had it for quite a while.
I heard Dan Blaylock talking one time, but when he was representing Dr. Sugg and King to sell it, and he was trying to get the state to buy it. And they mentioned that the state, he said, we tried to get the state to buy it, but Wilbur Boyd was the state senator there, and Dan could not get along with Wilbur. And so the state wouldn't do anything to it because Dan and Wilbur had a dispute. So anyway.
Lucky for us.
Yes. Lynn? What was his, how did he convey a vision to you? What was his vision?
Well, very similar to what Tom just said. You know, he saw, you know, the status of this land here was very special. You know, it was pristine. It had so many environmental things to go. It had beautiful views, beautiful wildlife, and it is. He used to say to us, he said, I don't want to just put anything out there. This has got to be something very special. And so that's why the idea of 6 high-rises or 4 high-rises or whatever never even crossed his mind, I believe. You know, he wanted to do something very unique. And I don't want to say money was no object, but you can tell from, and one of the questions that will come up later is the low density out here. I mean, there are many ways this project property could have been developed that would have made it much more economically feasible from the standpoint. But Randy, again, wanted something very special.
Jim, you mentioned you call him a visionary in some ways.
Yeah, so, Randy, and there's probably a couple of you who have met Randy, and I hope that he is able to come here and the rest of you talk to him sometime. And quite honestly, I haven't talked to him since the day he walked out the door, but we'd be friends, of course, at that time. But Randy is a very intelligent person, and he really is. But he is one of these kind of, the term visionary has been big picture and this type of thing. But Randy, I remember him using the term one time, hand painting. So this development in a lot of ways, Randy hand painted, and I'm sure Tom can agree on that, is that plans changed and changed and changed many, many times. But that's the way Randy did a lot of things. He had that vision. But he is one of these type of people, very, very charismatic. He can hold a room in his palm of his hand for a long time, and is really a larger-than-life individual when it really comes down to it. In fact, one time I remember we were at a birthday party for one of the workers, and you know, Randy had a T-shirt on, and that shirt said, "A legend in my own mind." And if that didn't sum up Randy, I mean, 40 years later, I look back, I think about that, and that was him, because he is just one of those individuals that's almost larger than life. And I was, you know, fortunate enough to spend some time with him, and I think he was just a wonderful, wonderful person, really is. I truly think he's a wonderful person.
Okay, let me go now to some specific questions. We're still going to have time for questions from everybody here, but I kind of want to cover things, so I thought we'd have an organized set of questions. Lynn, let me start with you, since infrastructure was the key. Describe the infrastructure challenges you had to build that causeway and get the uplands the size you needed, and get rid of all the zing peppers and whatever environmental.
Well, I was in the engineering business from '77 till 2 years ago when I retired, basically. And I'd have to say this is probably the most challenging project I ever worked on. I mean, the minute you came onto the property, you knew that you had challenges galore. You know, where am I going to put, you know, the roads? How am I going to handle stormwater? You know, water and sewer, just access across the channel there. One of the things Randy insisted on early on was the fact that the bridge that we were going to be building over the channel, kind of come onto the island, he didn't want just a concrete bridge. He wanted a wooden bridge because he wanted to give it that old Florida look. And we finally convinced him that a wooden bridge wasn't in the best interest of the project, because it would be a maintenance, you know, nightmare to have to maintain a wooden trestle-type bridge like that. So we finally convinced him we need to go with something that's going to be, you know, less maintenance, longer lasting, etc. And even though we wound up building a concrete bridge, those of you that were here from the early days, Randy insisted on having wood planks going across the bridge because he wanted that rumbling sound as people came on. And, eventually those have been removed because, again, it was a maintenance nightmare with the wood, and you've got pavers there now. But, that's just a little bit of how Randy wanted it. And like I say, he was very hands-on. Every curve in the road, every tree, every positioning of buildings and things like that. He was right there, tweaking it until he was satisfied with it. We had numerous meetings out on the site with them, looking, well, if I twist it this way, it's going to fit the trees better, but the view isn't as good, and things like that. So, he was a very deep, detailed person. This was a special project to him, and it was, as it was to everyone that worked on it. Environmentally, we had, like I say, numerous projects, problems. The causeway that comes through, you probably have noticed that the causeway road slopes toward the middle. It doesn't slope off to the sides because we had to take the stormwater that would come off of that road and treat it before we could release it into the environment. So we had to take it into the center of the road. There's a large pipe there that has big underdrain wrap around it, so the water actually that goes into that pipe gets filtered before it gets discharged into the environment. So that was something we had to, kind of come up with and brainstorm about, how we could handle it, because there was no room to add swales or any kind of retention ponds or anything like that, on that roadway. And even the roadway that comes through the main portion of the project here, there's lots of areas that are only what we call singly loaded, that only have houses or buildings on one side of the road. Normally in the most projects, you always want to try to what they call double load the road. You have houses on both sides, so your water and sewer can serve, on both sides of the road serves both ways, etc. But that wasn't possible here because we had very narrow constraints of where we could run roads or not run roads. And as you see, there's many portions of the road that don't have any buildings on either side of it either. Another aspect that came up that we hadn't anticipated is when they started to do excavations for the roadways or for homes, etc. They ran into some archaeological issues there. And so that was something that we had to address, and the state has a special requirement that you have to have an archaeologist come out, start doing excavations and figure out how important that particular Indian mound or relics they found were, and what you had to do to satisfy the state. The environmental agencies would come out to the site, and as soon as they walked out here, they would say, wow, what a magnificent place, and it was very special. So they weren't about to cut us any slack as far as saying, well, we'll let you do this if you do this. No, it was by the book all the way pretty much. And so we were constantly having to, put our thinking caps on and figure out, okay, how are we going to solve this problem or that problem? Because they were just, every time you turned around, there was another issue someplace. So it was, like I say, the most challenging project I had ever been involved with and had been involved with ever since then, too. So.
I assume then there was a tree survey, so all these oak trees are original oak trees, pretty much.
Well, I'm sure that we've added some, but yeah, most of the larger oaks,
Right.
of course, have been out here for a long time.
You had to do some dredging on this lake and get the fill, and so where did the fill come from?
Well, you got some out of the lake, but the lake versus the fill that we would need for the homes and for the road doesn't come close. So we had to truck in a lot of fill. And one thing we had going for us on this project is that typically if I build a project in, West Braden someplace or East Braden or whatever, you have to meet two criteria. One is you have to treat the stormwater to make sure that the nutrients from fertilizers and things like that are taken out of the stormwater before you discharge it. Otherwise, you get